The cold Chicago wind whistled through the cracks of the abandoned building where 12-year-old Marcus Johnson had made his temporary home. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, trying to keep warm in the early morning chill. 8 months had passed since his mother's death, but the pain in his heart felt as fresh as the day she left him. Marcus sat up on his makeshift bed, a pile of flattened cardboard boxes covered with an old blanket he'd found behind a department store. The first rays of sunlight peeped through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. This wasn't the life his mother had wanted for him, but it was the only option he had after she passed away from an illness they couldn't afford to treat. Every morning, Marcus followed the same routine. He splashed some water on his face from a plastic bottle he kept refilling at a nearby park fountain. Then he carefully combed his hair using a small broken mirror he found in a dumpster. His mother had always taught him that being homeless didn't mean he had to look homeless. "Keep your dignity," she used to say. "It's something nobody can take from you unless you let them." The boy reached under his cardboard bed and pulled out his most precious possession, a small photo of him and his mother, taken on his 10th birthday. In the picture, they were both smiling, his mother's arms wrapped tightly around him as he blew out the candles on a small cupcake. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago now. As his stomach growled loudly, Marcus remembered that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. He knew the shelter on 43rd Street served breakfast at 7 a.m., but it was already 6:45. If he ran, he might make it in time. Quickly putting on his worn-out sneakers, he tied the laces that he'd fixed multiple times with knots. The streets were starting to come alive as Marcus ran. Early morning workers waited at bus stops, coffee shop owners pulled up their shutters, and newspaper delivery boys made their rounds. Nobody paid attention to the young black boy running past them. In a big city like Chicago, people learned to mind their own business. At the shelter, Marcus joined the line just as the doors opened. Miss Betty, one of the regular volunteers, gave him a warm smile. She had a soft spot for him because, unlike some other homeless kids, he always said please and thank you, and helped clean up after meals when he could. "Good morning, Marcus," she said, serving him a bowl of hot oatmeal and a banana. "I saved you an extra piece of toast today." "Thank you, Miss Betty," he replied politely, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the food. The old woman's kindness reminded him of his mother, making his heart ache a little more. After breakfast, Marcus headed to his secret spot in the public library. Even though he couldn't go to school anymore, he was determined to keep learning. His mother had been a teacher's assistant before she got sick, and she had always stressed the importance of education. "Knowledge is the one thing nobody can steal from you," she would tell him. In the library's quiet corner, Marcus spent hours reading books about science and mathematics. He solved problems in an old notebook he'd found, using a pencil stub he kept carefully sharpened with a borrowed library pencil sharpener. Some days, when the librarian Mrs. Thompson was working, she would secretly slip him a granola bar or a juice box, pretending she was just cleaning up left-behind items. As evening approached, Marcus walked back to his abandoned building, taking the long route through safer streets. He'd learned which areas to avoid, which shopkeepers were kind enough to give away food that was about to expire, and which public bathrooms were usually clean and safe to use. Back in his corner of the abandoned building, Marcus wrapped himself in his blanket as the temperature began to drop again. Despite his harsh circumstances, he hadn't given up hope. His mother had taught him that life could change in an instant, sometimes for worse, but sometimes for better too. As he drifted off to sleep, his mother's words echoed in his mind. "Stay honest, stay strong, and keep your heart pure, Marcus. Good things happen to good people, even if it takes time." Little did Marcus know that tomorrow would be the day his life would begin to change forever. The sun was setting behind the tall buildings of Chicago when Marcus began his daily search for recyclable cans and bottles behind Wilson's grocery store. The owner, Mr. Wilson, was one of the few people who didn't chase him away. Sometimes, he even left bags of cans separately for Marcus to find easily. Today was different, though. As Marcus walked past the store's back parking lot, something caught his eye. There, on a wooden bench near the dumpster, sat a brown leather purse. It looked expensive, the kind he'd seen wealthy women carry in the nice part of town. His heart started beating faster as he approached it. Looking around carefully, Marcus saw no one nearby. The parking lot was empty except for a few employee cars. He picked up the purse, surprised by how heavy it felt. The leather was soft and smooth, nothing like the rough fabric of his worn backpack. Marcus sat down on the bench and slowly opened the purse. Inside, he found a wallet stuffed with credit cards and cash. More money than he'd seen in months. His hands trembled as he counted the bills. $340. That much money could buy him food for weeks, maybe even a new pair of shoes to replace his tattered ones. But there was more in the purse. A small photo album caught his attention. Inside were pictures of a woman with 2 young children, all of them smiling at the camera. There was also a hospital ID card with the name Dr. Sarah Thompson and an address in the wealthy Highland Park neighborhood. Marcus's stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast at the shelter. The money in his hands could change that. He could buy a hot meal, new clothes, maybe even rent a room for a few nights. No one would know. The owner probably had plenty of money anyway, being a doctor. Just then, his mother's voice echoed in his mind. He remembered the last Christmas they had spent together when they had found a wallet on the bus. Despite having no money for presents that year, his mother had insisted on returning it. Our integrity is worth more than any amount of money, she had told him. When we do the right thing, we can hold our heads high. Marcus looked at the family photos again. Dr. Thompson's smile reminded him of his own mother's, warm and kind. He thought about how worried she must be, losing all her cards and money. Maybe she had children waiting for dinner, counting on that money for food. With shaking hands, he put everything back exactly as he had found it. The address on her ID card was on the other side of town. It would take him over an hour to walk there. The sun was already setting, and he knew the streets became more dangerous after dark. Still, Marcus stood up, holding the purse carefully. He could almost hear his mother's voice saying, "Do what's right, even when it's hard." Taking a deep breath, he began his long walk to Highland Park. As he walked, Marcus passed restaurants with warm lights and delicious smells that made his stomach ache. He saw families through apartment windows, sitting down to dinner together. Each step was a battle between his desperate need and his mother's teachings about honesty. The streets changed as he walked north, becoming cleaner, with bigger houses and fancier cars. Some people crossed the street when they saw him coming, clutching their own bags tighter. Marcus was used to this treatment, but it still hurt every time. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Marcus stood in front of a beautiful 3-story house with a perfectly maintained garden. Light shone through the large windows, and he could hear children's laughter from inside. His feet hurt, his stomach was empty, and the purse felt heavier than ever. For one last moment, Marcus hesitated. He could still turn around, use the money to make his life better. No one would ever know, but deep in his heart, he would know. Taking a deep breath, he walked up the steps and rang the doorbell, holding the purse tightly in his trembling hands. The porch light came on, and Marcus heard footsteps approaching the door. This was it, the moment that would test everything his mother had taught him about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it might be. Marcus's heart pounded as he waited on the doorstep of the Thompson house. The sound of approaching footsteps made him want to run, but he stood his ground. His mother had always told him that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. The door opened slowly, and a woman in her early 40s appeared. She wore blue hospital scrubs under a warm sweater, and her face showed signs of worry and stress. When she saw Marcus standing there, her eyes widened with surprise, then quickly darted to the purse in his hands. I found your purse," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly. He held it out to her with both hands. "Everything's still inside. I didn't take anything." Dr. Thompson stood frozen for a moment, looking from the purse to the young boy standing before her. She recognized him as someone who didn't belong in this wealthy neighborhood, with his worn-out clothes and shoes that were falling apart. Yet here he was, returning her purse. "Please, come inside," she said, opening the door wider. "It's cold out there." Marcus hesitated. He'd been taught never to enter strangers' homes, but the warmth flowing from inside was tempting, and his feet ached from the long walk. After a moment's thought, he stepped into the heated foyer. "I'm Dr. Thompson, but you can call me Sarah," she said, leading him to a comfortable kitchen. The room smelled like fresh-baked cookies, and Marcus's empty stomach rumbled loudly. He blushed, embarrassed by the sound. Sarah quickly checked through her purse, finding everything exactly as she'd left it. "I can't believe you walked all this way to return it," she said, looking at Marcus with growing curiosity and concern. "Would you like something to eat? I just made cookies. and I could fix you a sandwich." Before Marcus could answer, two children peered around the kitchen door, a boy about 9 and a girl who looked 7. They watched him with curious eyes until their mother shooed them away to do their homework. "Thank you," Marcus said politely, "but I should go. It's getting late." He turned toward the door, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, reaching for her purse. "Let me give you a reward for your honesty. This money could have been tempting for anyone, especially—" She paused, noticing his shabby clothes again. But Marcus shook his head firmly. "No, thank you," he said, standing a little straighter. "My mom always said we should do the right thing because it's right, not for a reward." His voice cracked slightly when he mentioned his mother, and he saw something change in Sarah's expression. "Where is your mother now?" she asked gently, noting how Marcus's eyes filled with tears at the question. "She died," he said quietly. 8 months ago. Cancer." He didn't know why he was telling her this. He usually kept his story to himself. But something about Sarah reminded him of his mother. Maybe it was the kind look in her eyes or the smell of home-baked cookies that filled her kitchen. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for Marcus to join her. "Please, sit. Just for a few minutes. Let me at least give you something to eat before you go." This time, Marcus couldn't resist. The warmth of the kitchen, the smell of food, and Sarah's gentle manner broke through his defenses. He sat down, and soon found himself with a plate of cookies and a large glass of milk in front of him. As he ate, Sarah asked him careful questions about his life: where he slept, how he got food, whether he was still in school. With each answer, her face grew more concerned, though she tried to hide it. When Marcus finally stood to leave, Sarah wrote something on a piece of paper. "This is my phone number," she said, pressing it into his hand. "If you ever need help, or just a warm meal, please call. Promise me?" Marcus nodded, carefully folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. As he walked back into the cold night, he felt different somehow. For the first time since his mother died, someone had looked at him not with pity or suspicion, but with genuine care. Little did he know that Sarah Thompson was already forming a plan that would change his life forever. 2 days after returning the purse, Marcus sat in his usual corner of the public library, trying to concentrate on a math book. But his mind kept wandering back to the warmth of Dr. Thompson's kitchen and the taste of those fresh cookies. He hadn't eaten anything but shelter food since that evening, and his stomach growled at the memory. The piece of paper with Sarah's phone number was still in his pocket, worn soft from him taking it out and looking at it so many times. He hadn't called her yet. Pride and fear held him back. But on this cold morning, as rain pounded against the library windows, he couldn't stop thinking about her kind offer. "Marcus!" A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Mrs. Wilson, the librarian, standing beside his table. "Someone's here to see you." His heart nearly stopped when he saw Dr. Thompson walking towards him, carrying a large paper bag. She was dressed in casual clothes today instead of her hospital scrubs, and her face lit up when she saw him. "I've been looking for you," she said, sitting down across from him. "I checked the shelter on 43rd Street, and Miss Betty told me I might find you here." She placed the paper bag on the table. "I brought you some lunch." Marcus stared at the bag, his mouth watering at the smell of warm food. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, but Sarah just smiled and pushed the bag closer. "I want to talk to you about something important," she said, watching as he carefully took out a wrapped sandwich and hot soup in a thermal container. "But first, please eat." As Marcus ate, Sarah told him how she hadn't been able to stop thinking about him since that night. She and her husband James had spent hours discussing his situation. "What you did, returning my purse when you had nothing, it showed extraordinary character," she said. "It reminded us that there are still people in this world who choose to do the right thing, no matter how hard their circumstances." Marcus listened, taking small bites to make the food last longer. He noticed Sarah watching him with the same concerned look his mother used to have when he was sick. "We'd like to help you, Marcus," she continued. "James and I have been talking to social services. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We'd like to offer you a place to stay, with us." The half-eaten sandwich nearly fell from Marcus's hands. "What?" "We have a spare bedroom," Sarah explained. "You'd have your own space, regular meals, clean clothes. You could go back to school." She leaned forward, her eyes serious. "But only if you want to. We won't force you into anything." Marcus sat very still, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to run. It seemed too good to be true. But another part, the part that still ached for a home, for family, couldn't ignore this chance. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Sarah reached across the table and gently took his hand. "Because when you brought back my purse, you showed me something rare, a pure heart in a world that often seems to have forgotten about kindness. My husband and I have been blessed with so much, and we believe we're meant to share those blessings." Tears filled Marcus's eyes as he thought about what his mother would say. She had always told him that God worked in mysterious ways, that good things happened to good people who stayed true to their values. I don't want to be a burden," he said softly. "You wouldn't be," Sarah assured him. "We thought this through carefully. James and I both agree. We want to help you build a better future. Will you at least consider it?" Marcus looked around the library that had been his refuge for so many months. He thought about his cold corner in the abandoned building, the constant hunger, the loneliness. Then he thought about the warmth of Sarah's kitchen, the sounds of children's laughter, the feeling of being cared for again. Slowly, he nodded, and Sarah's face broke into a bright smile. As they sat there in the quiet library, neither of them knew this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would change not only Marcus's life, but the lives of everyone around him. Sarah and James Thompson sat in their home office late that evening, surrounded by papers and documents. After Marcus had agreed to consider their offer, Sarah's husband had immediately started gathering information about the proper legal procedures they would need to follow. His mother's name was Angela Johnson, James said, reading from his laptop screen. She worked as a teacher's assistant at Lincoln Elementary School until she got sick. He paused, looking at a medical record. Stage 4 breast cancer. They couldn't afford proper treatment on her insurance. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she looked at a photo of Angela and Marcus from happier times. The resemblance between mother and son was striking. They had the same gentle eyes and warm smile. The picture had been taken at Marcus's school just a year ago, before everything fell apart. "Look at this," James said, pointing to his screen. Marcus's grades were excellent before he had to leave school. Even his last teacher noted that he was reading above his grade level. He shook his head in amazement. This kid kept studying at the library while being homeless. That shows incredible determination. Their children, Emma and Luke, peeked around the office door, curious about all the activity. "Is Marcus really going to live with us?" Emma asked hopefully. She had been excited ever since her parents explained their plans to help the boy who had returned her mother's purse. "We hope so, sweetheart," Sarah answered. "But there's a lot we need to do first. It's not as simple as just giving him a room." She turned back to James. "What did social services say?" James shuffled through some papers on his desk. "They're sending someone tomorrow to interview us. We'll need to get approved as foster parents, which includes background checks and home inspections." He smiled at his wife. "Good thing you keep the house so spotless." Sarah wasn't listening. She was reading a report about the shelter where Marcus had been getting his meals. It says here he never caused any trouble, always helped clean up, and was unfailingly polite to volunteers. She looked up at James. "Every piece of information we find just confirms what I saw in him that night." The phone rang, and James answered it. It was their family lawyer, calling with news about the guardianship process. As James took notes, Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably trying to stay warm in that abandoned building. The thought made her heart ache. "Good news," James said, hanging up the phone. "Because there are no other living relatives claiming guardianship, and given the circumstances, our lawyer thinks the process could be expedited. Marcus's situation would be considered an emergency placement." Sarah nodded, picking up a form from the desk. It was Marcus's last school report card, showing all A's and B's despite his mother's illness. "We'll need to get him back in school as soon as possible," she said. "He's already missed so much." "I can tutor him," Luke offered from the doorway. At 11, he was just a year younger than Marcus. "I'm good at math." His parents smiled at his eagerness to help. "That's very kind of you, Luke," James said. "Marcus might need a friend more than a tutor at first, though." Sarah sat down at the desk again, determination in her eyes. "We need to make this work," she said firmly. "That boy has been through so much. yet he still chose to do the right thing. He deserves a chance at a better life. James reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. "We'll make it work," he assured her. "Between your medical background, my legal connections, and our family's support, we'll give Marcus everything he needs to thrive." As the night grew later, the Thompsons continued their preparations. Tomorrow would bring social workers, legal meetings, and the beginning of a complex process. But they were ready for the challenge. Sometimes they realized the most important decisions in life weren't the ones you planned for, but the ones that came unexpectedly, testing your heart and changing your world forever. The morning of the social worker's visit arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the windows of the Thompson home. Sarah had woken up early to make sure everything was perfect, though James kept telling her to relax. Marcus sat quietly on the living room couch, wearing new clothes the Thompsons had bought him the day before. Ms. Rodriguez, the social worker, arrived exactly at 9 o'clock. She was a kind-looking woman with gray-streaked hair and warm brown eyes. She carried a thick folder and a laptop, setting them carefully on the coffee table. "So, Marcus," she said gently, "Dr. and Mr. Thompson have told me about your situation, but I'd like to hear it from you. Can you tell me about what happened after your mother passed away?" Marcus looked at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. He took a deep breath and began telling his story. He explained how he had tried to stay in their old apartment at first, but couldn't pay the rent. How he had kept going to school as long as he could, doing his homework in the public library. How he had finally ended up in the abandoned building, too ashamed to tell anyone at school that he was homeless. Ms. Rodriguez typed notes as she listened, occasionally asking gentle questions. Her eyes softened when Marcus described how he still studied at the library, borrowing textbooks to keep up with his education. "Marcus," she said, looking up from her laptop, "did you know that your test scores from last year were in the top 5% of your grade?" When Marcus shook his head, she smiled. "Your teachers noted that you had extraordinary potential. They were very worried when you stopped coming to school." Sarah and James exchanged proud looks. They had already seen Marcus's intelligence in the way he spoke about books and solved math problems in his head. "Now," Ms. Rodriguez continued, turning to the Thompsons, "you understand that becoming foster parents is a serious commitment. There will be regular checkups, mandatory training sessions, and ongoing evaluations." "We understand completely," James replied firmly. "We've already enrolled in the required parenting classes and child welfare training programs. Our lawyer has prepared all the necessary documentation." Sarah reached over and took Marcus's hand. "We want to give Marcus a stable home, a good education, and most importantly, a family who cares about him." Ms. Rodriguez nodded approvingly as she reviewed more documents on her laptop. "Your background checks have come back clean, your home study is excellent, and your financial situation is more than adequate." She looked around the spacious living room. Marcus would have his own room. "Yes," Sarah answered quickly. "We've already prepared it. Would you like to see it?" They all went upstairs to what used to be the guest room. The Thompsons had spent the weekend transforming it into a proper bedroom for a 12-year-old boy. There was a new desk for studying, a comfortable bed with fresh linens, a bookshelf already filled with books, and even a small basketball hoop on the back of the door. Marcus stood in the doorway, his eyes wide. He hadn't seen the room yet. The Thompsons had wanted it to be a surprise. This is for me," he whispered. "All yours," James said, putting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Emma and Luke helped pick out the books. They remembered you saying you liked science fiction." Ms. Rodriguez watched the scene with a smile, making more notes on her tablet. "Well," she said finally, "given the emergency nature of Marcus's situation and the exceptional circumstances of this case, I'm going to recommend immediate temporary placement with the Thompsons, pending final approval." She turned to Marcus. "How do you feel about that? Would you like to stay here?" Marcus looked around the room again, then at Sarah and James's hopeful faces. He thought about his mother, about how she had always wanted the best for him. Slowly, he nodded, tears filling his eyes. "Yes," he said softly, "I would like that very much." As Ms. Rodriguez began explaining the next steps in the process, Marcus walked over to the window of his new room. For the first time since his mother died, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. The first few weeks in the Thompson house were like a dream for Marcus. Each morning, he would wake up in his comfortable bed, still amazed that he had a room of his own. The simple things that most people took for granted, hot showers, clean clothes, regular meals, felt like incredible luxuries to him. Sarah and James had enrolled him in the same school their children attended. On his first day, Marcus stood nervously in front of his new classroom, wearing a crisp school uniform that Sarah had carefully ironed. His new backpack felt heavy with fresh notebooks and supplies. "You've got this," Luke whispered, giving him an encouraging smile before heading to his own class. Over the past weeks, Luke had become like a brother to Marcus, showing him around the neighborhood and teaching him how to play video games. Marcus's new teacher, Mrs. Bennett, had been briefed about his situation. She was impressed when she tested his knowledge and found that despite missing months of school, he had managed to keep up with most subjects through his self-study at the library. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Sarah told him one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, going over his homework. Marcus had just gotten an A on his first math test. She raised an extraordinary young man. Tears filled Marcus's eyes at the mention of his mother. Sarah immediately put her arm around him, pulling him close. "It's okay to miss her," she said softly. "We can talk about her whenever you want. She'll always be part of who you are." The transformation wasn't just academic. Regular meals and proper care had put healthy color in Marcus's cheeks. His too-thin frame was filling out, and he was growing taller. James had started teaching him to play basketball in the driveway after dinner, and Marcus discovered he had a natural talent for the sport. Emma, the youngest Thompson, had appointed herself Marcus's personal cheerleader. She sat in the front row at his first school basketball game, waving a homemade sign with his name on it. When he scored his first basket, her excited screams could be heard throughout the gym. But not everything was easy. Sometimes Marcus would wake up in the middle of the night, panicking because he couldn't remember where he was. Other times, certain smells or sounds would remind him of his mother, and grief would hit him hard and unexpected. During these moments, the Thompsons showed their true colors. They never rushed his healing or tried to replace his mother's memory. Instead, they created space for his grief while gently helping him build a new life. "Healing takes time," Sarah would say, sitting with him during difficult moments. "You're allowed to be happy here and still miss your mom. Both feelings can exist together." One Saturday morning, James found Marcus sitting alone in the backyard, looking at his mother's picture. Instead of leaving him alone, James sat down beside him. "Tell me about her," James said quietly. "What kind of person was she?" For the next hour, Marcus shared stories about his mother. Her laugh, her cooking, the way she would sing while cleaning the house. James listened attentively, asking questions and smiling at the happy memories. "You know," James said when Marcus finished, "when Sarah and I decided to become your foster parents, we weren't trying to replace your mother. We just wanted to continue the amazing job she started, helping you grow into the wonderful person she knew you could be." Marcus nodded, understanding. "She would have liked you guys," he said softly. "She always said that good people recognize other good people." That evening, during family dinner, Marcus looked around the table at the faces that had become so dear to him. Luke was telling a funny story about school, Emma was giggling, Sarah was serving seconds of her lasagna, and James was pretending to steal food from everyone's plates. In that moment, Marcus realized something important. His mother had been right. Good things did happen to good people, even if sometimes they came through unexpected paths. He was still Angela Johnson's son, but now he was also becoming part of something new, a family that had chosen him, just as he had chosen to do the right thing that day with the purse. 2 years had passed since that cold evening when Marcus returned Sarah's purse. Today, the Thompson house was filled with excitement and decoration. Balloons floated in clusters, and a large banner read, "Congratulations, Marcus." It was adoption day. After 2 years as foster parents, Sarah and James were officially making Marcus a permanent part of their family. The judge had scheduled their court appearance for 2 p.m., and everyone was getting ready in their best clothes. "Mom, my tie isn't straight," Marcus called out, then paused, still amazed at how natural it felt now to call Sarah Mom. She appeared in his doorway, smiling as she fixed his tie with practiced hands. "Perfect," she said, stepping back to look at him. At 14, Marcus had grown tall and strong. Regular meals, sports, and a loving home had transformed him from the scared, hungry boy they'd met 2 years ago. But his kind heart and gentle spirit remained unchanged. The brown leather purse that had brought them together sat in a glass case in the living room. It had become a family symbol, reminding them that sometimes the smallest acts of honesty could change lives forever. At the courthouse, Marcus spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Miss Betty from the shelter was there, beaming proudly. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian who had helped him study during his homeless days, sat next to her. Even Mr. Wilson from the grocery store had come, carrying a large gift-wrapped package. The adoption ceremony itself was brief but emotional. When the judge asked Marcus if he wanted to be officially adopted by the Thompsons, his yes was clear and strong. Emma and Luke, now his official siblings, cheered so loudly that the judge had to hide a smile. By the power vested in me, the judge announced, I hereby declare Marcus Johnson Thompson legally adopted into the Thompson family. She smiled warmly at Marcus. You are very fortunate to have such a loving family. Actually, Marcus replied, his voice steady, they're the ones who taught me that fortune has nothing to do with it. It's about choices. My mother taught me to always choose what's right, and that's what led me to them. Back at home, during the celebration, Marcus shared his story with a local newspaper reporter. The article would later inspire many families to consider fostering children in need. Marcus made sure the reporter understood the most important part, that his story wasn't just about him, but about all the people who had helped him along the way. See this purse? He told the reporter, pointing to the glass case. It taught me that one honest choice can start a chain reaction of goodness. Now, I want to help create that same chance for others. Marcus had already started working toward that goal. He had created a student organization at his school that collected supplies for homeless children and tutored kids at the shelter where he used to eat. His story had inspired many of his classmates to volunteer with him. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home, Marcus sat in the backyard with his new family. The stars were bright in the sky, just like they had been on the nights when he used to sleep in the abandoned building. But now, instead of feeling alone, he was surrounded by love. I have something for you, Sarah said, handing him a small box. Inside was a keychain with 2 items on it, a new house key with his initials, and a small silver locket. When he opened the locket, he found a tiny picture of his birth mother on one side and his new family on the other. This way, Sarah explained softly, you'll always carry both parts of your heart with you. Marcus hugged her tightly, then reached out to include James, Luke, and Emma in the embrace. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from losing everything to gaining a whole new world of love and possibility. As they sat together under the stars, Marcus knew that his story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. He had gone from being a homeless boy to having 2 families, one in his memory and one in his daily life. Both had taught him the same valuable lesson, that integrity, love, and courage could overcome any obstacle. And somewhere, he was sure, his mother was smiling down at him, proud of the choice he had made that cold evening 2 years ago and all the choices that had followed.